This feels like I played the raffles, Japanese raffles, and I won this giant Chun-Li statue, I guess. It's like almost a foot tall. Today is March 22nd, 2025, and we are now officially 5 years past the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's debatable when the pandemic really started, but I would say for me, living here in New York City, the pandemic started on March 20th of 2020, because that is the day that the mayor of New York, at that time, Mayor de Blasio, announced a lockdown. And the lockdown simply meant that non-essential travel was basically completely shut off, so encouraging people to stay home and basically shut down businesses and the economy, because if people are staying home, not going into the office, then no one needs to get food and order lunch. The subway still ran, but essentially the city of New York turned into a ghost city overnight, like a scene out of some sort of zombie or apocalypse movie. So I wanted to make this video to talk about a few themes or things that change within society, at least as a result of the pandemic. 5 years is a really long time, and it's certainly a lot of time to process and digest and look back at not only how things turned out, but also our own context and our own experiences within the time period. I know certainly for me, a lot has changed, and I'm sure that certainly for many of you, a lot has changed. So I think the first major theme or idea that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed was the fact that government, not just here in the US, but governments all around the world were largely unprepared and in some cases incompetent. At first, when I was thinking about this video, I simply wanted to call this theme incompetence, but I don't think that's entirely accurate. Incompetence just means that someone or something, an organization, whatever it may be, is not up to the task of performing or executing something like a project or initiative. And in that sense, I would say governments were largely incompetent in terms of how they managed and reacted to the pandemic as it unfolded. But an important factor outside of incompetence is that they were also largely unprepared. And I think the lack of preparedness certainly fed into their relative incompetence. So let's start with the lack of preparedness. So here in the United States, as the pandemic unfolded in real time, it was pretty obvious to me that Trump and his administration had no real plan on how to contain the spread of the virus and how to mitigate and manage the potential damage. If we go back to 2014, there was an Ebola outbreak throughout the world. And at that point, then President Obama took notice of that, and he created a specific team that was nestled within the National Security Council, dedicated solely to addressing potential epidemics and pandemics. Of course, 2 years later, in 2018, when Trump was in power, his administration disbanded this team because clearly that's not important. Why would we need a team within a certain high-level government agency in America that is dedicated solely to thinking about how do we respond to a pandemic? And of course, 2 years later, COVID-19 hit the world, and well, America was largely unprepared. Even in real time, watching Trump fumble in press conferences, it didn't seem like his team had any real plan in place. They weren't especially assertive in terms of things that they had laid out and communicated with the public. And they didn't act very quickly either. There were cases of the COVID-19 virus and infecting people throughout all of that winter, I think as early as December, certainly by January, and certainly by February. So it wasn't a complete shock that this airborne virus that was popping up in different spots around the world would eventually come to America and eventually spread to the rest of the world. One of the most absurd things that happened. Because I actually looked up on Wikipedia what was Trump and his administration's official response was there were 14 Americans that contracted COVID-19 on a cruise ship in February. At that point, the CDC recommended that if we allowed these 14 Americans back into the country, that they should be forced to quarantine to make sure that one, they are fully recovered from the COVID 19 virus, and two, to prevent the potential spread of COVID 19 here in America. And guess what happened? Trump had his, I believe, CDC administrator overrule the recommendation. So we just let 14 people back into this country, even though they had all tested positive and contracted COVID 19. Great. I'm just going to say that doesn't sound very well thought out. It doesn't seem like they had a protocol in place of, hey, if there is a potential pandemic, someone contracts, in this case, COVID 19, how do we handle it? Do we test them? Do we allow them back into this country? When do we allow them back into this country? If we allow them back into this country, do we quarantine them? And if we do quarantine them, how do we set that up? Which agency is in charge of setting up the lodging, of monitoring it, of securing the facility, of doing the testing, of providing medical care, so on and so forth. And of course, you have to think about things like, well, where is the funding and budget of this going to come out of? So clearly, none of that was in place by February. None of it was in place when the pandemic hit. So, what a real plan is supposed to look like in terms of preparing for a pandemic is a lot of what I just touched on. It is, you have to have an agency or a team in place that is responsible for monitoring the potential of a pandemic. So, they have to be in touch with other health organizations in other countries. They have to be in touch with hospitals and medical providers here in America. And if they detect a sign of a virus that is spreading throughout the globe, then they have to have a process in place. How do they surface that information? Who did they surface it to? Is it the president? Is it someone at one of the agencies? And then from there on, a process and protocol has to be put into place where someone is forced to act. Someone is forced to take the information that's available. Hey, looks like a pandemic is spreading. And then once they've laid out what the next possible steps are, okay, if a pandemic is happening at this rate, maybe we should do this. If a pandemic is mostly relegated to foreign borders, here's some things we can do. Clearly, that was never in place. The Trump administration had never thought of those things. And I would say it's not just the federal government here, even the state government and the city government, they were largely not prepared for the reality of a pandemic and how to manage it, how to mitigate it, how to manage an entire city, how to communicate to citizens, how to tell them what to do and try to keep them safe. I would go so far as to say they weren't even prepared for the possibility of a pandemic. It was like they had never thought that this might be possible, that in their mind they felt like, well, this is never going to happen. I mean, it's not like we live in a society where people are flying through the globe and the likelihood of an airborne virus spreading is not necessarily a probability, but just an inevitability. How's that look? Ooh, seems pretty bright. Well, if I'm going to be talking to a camera, I might as well do two things at once. Also build this bookshelf. These two frames, I'm going to build the frames first. The second thing that the pandemic exposed about America was that a lot of people were inherently selfish. Let's start with the hoarders. I think anyone who was out at a grocery store or certainly a wholesale club like Costco's probably saw these hoarders in action. Here we go. For the most part, the hoarders were just normal, everyday people. They were probably people that you knew. They were your neighbors, co-workers, friends, maybe even family members. For whatever reason, once the pandemic hit, a lot of these people thought
They needed stuff, a lot of stuff. They needed to hoard this stuff. And we're not talking crazy things that are worth a lot, like PlayStation 5s or sports cards or Pokemon cards, things that did shoot up in value during the pandemic. We were talking about mundane, everyday household items like toilet paper, cleaning supplies, wet wipes. If you were out and about just shopping, you couldn't miss these people. Their carts were full of really months, if not years, worth of these everyday supplies. I think part of it was out of fear. I think people looked at the situation and they weren't sure if things were going to get much worse. Potentially, that might mean that everyone would be forced to lock down inside their homes. And in that situation, you probably want stuff like toilet paper and cleaning supplies. How does this thing go? So I think some of it was definitely a sense of fear, of uncertainty. And the truth was, there was no shortage of anything. There was no real shortage of toilet paper or cleaning supplies. The shortage was all in people's minds. It was imaginary. But there's an effect of sort of contagion that happens because if you are a normal and reasonable person and you say to yourself, this is nuts, I don't need reams of toilet paper in my home, but you see at your local Sam's Club or Costco that everyone else is buying toilet paper and they're pretty much almost out, well, you are also going to start adding reams of toilet paper to your shopping cart because it's just human nature. You don't want to miss out on something. You see everyone else is grabbing something and you feel that scarcity effect, so you start grabbing it too. Now, those are just the hoarders. There is an entirely different category of people that I would call scalpers. These were people who bought up a lot of stuff, essential stuff, in hopes of reselling it on Facebook Marketplace to their neighbors at a significant markup. In fact, I recall that there was one guy, I want to say he was in Tennessee. He had an entire garage full of, I think it was hand sanitizer, and the government actually had to get involved and step in. And I think he got charged with like price gouging or something to that effect. There were also people who simply felt like there was a capitalistic opportunity to take advantage of the fact that certain things were in short supply. And if that isn't a definition of selfish, then I don't know what is. I think when we are thinking about people and the way they hoarded everyday items, it's really hard to say where fear ends and greed begins. I just think that there's a human element there. People see that other people are buying certain things and, well, they're going to buy it too. And I think part of this was due to the fact that, well, the government's handling of things was actually inadequate. They looked around and they saw that no level of government had any real plan on how to deal with the pandemic and how to mitigate the potential damage. So they just probably felt like, well, we're just out here on our own. Like at the end of the day, the government's probably not coming to help us or save us. So if we're out here on our own, we should just buy more of the stuff. Who knows what's going to happen? Things might get really crazy very soon. Of course, that never actually happened, so a lot of people just ended up with a lot of toilet paper. The next category of selfish people are, well, the people who refuse to wear masks. I don't love wearing masks myself. Depending on the activity you're doing, depending on what the weather is like, they're easy to lose. They're not exactly comfortable to wear. I get it. I completely get it. I am not here to tell you that wearing a mask is the same as just going about your day without a mask. However, I am a reasonable human being. And clearly, if there is an airborne virus that is, come on. Clearly, if there is an airborne virus that is making its way and spreading throughout the country, and we know it's airborne, and we know that transmission occurs through droplets from coughing or sneezing, then To me, it just makes sense that the easiest way to prevent spread and prevent myself from getting it, and of course, then passing it on to my family and friends, would be simply to just wear a mask. But apparently, a lot of Americans disagreed. And I think they disagreed for two reasons or on basis of two different ideas. The first was a very anti-science approach. There were people who were arguing that the masks didn't work, okay? And then there are people who also argued in the same vein that if you somehow were sick, that the mask would make you sicker. Now, of course, both of those ideas are sheer nonsense, but that's just the first rationale. The second was a very anti-authoritarian, or I guess depending on how you see it, pro-personal liberty take. And this really stemmed from the idea that asking people to wear a mask was somehow un-American and infringed on their personal liberties. And to do so was to have not only the government ask that they wear a mask, but in certain situations, businesses enforce that rule was frankly, apparently communist. Never mind that we were in a global pandemic. But you, Joe and Jane from Middle America, no, it's too much to ask you to wear a mask for the little bit of time that you are outside grocery shopping or whatever. I think we got to put this to the side. And I can also see how this came about. Again, it had a lot to do with the government's inadequate handling of the situation. I think a lot of people looked around and they looked at how the Trump administration bungled the initial pandemic rollout and how they really failed to do anything of note and mitigate the damage. They looked around and asked themselves, well, you suck so much at managing and putting a plan in place. I mean, they had no plan. So now you're asking me to wear a mask. Why should we do it? Why should we trust you? Why should we believe you? Why should I wear a mask or further down the line, get a vaccine? Then the screw goes underneath into this smaller board. Nice. I hate to use this cliche, but it really did feel like the pandemic broke something in people. There's that famous JFK quote, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And for whatever reason, a lot of people during the pandemic said to themselves, well, this country has really not done much for me. They really screwed up the way they handle this, and now people are dying every day. Why should I give up something? Why should I make sacrifices? Why should I do anything to help anyone else? A very cynical take. You know, for me personally, I always want to believe in, I don't know, the best of people is the right term, but I want to believe that when push comes to shove, people and humanity can come together and do the right thing to help each other out, to help people in need, to ensure our mutual survival. And to be clear, I don't think that everyone was selfish during the initial stages of the pandemic. Right around the initial stages of the pandemic, a mutual aid organization popped up here in Queens, or maybe they were already around, but I volunteered with them. And I volunteered with them to volunteer in my car, and I did grocery runs and I did food bank runs just because I was unemployed. I really had nothing better to do, and I figure, well, if I'm going to be sitting around anyway, I might as well use my car and help out other people here in Queens. So it's not fair to say that everyone was selfish, and I don't want to make it seem that way. I'm sure there were a lot of people who helped others, who helped out their neighbors, who volunteered, helped out, churches, mosques, whatever it is, helped out whoever it is that needed help. But there's no question that there was probably a minority, I don't think it was that many people, but a very vocal minority of people who clearly were selfish in many different ways. and didn't matter that we were in a pandemic, that we were all in it together, and that things would have been gone much better if we all cooperated in small ways. No. There were some people who were very greedy. There were some people who were very irrational, and they just said to themselves, screw this, screw everyone else. I'm simply going to do what I think is right. One of my favorite movies is The Dark Knight, and that's the Batman movie with Christian Bale as Batman and Heath Ledger as the Joker. And one of the core conflicts or themes of the movie was this idea that the Joker fervently believed that if push comes to shove, the rule of law had disappeared, and if society had broken down to a state of chaos in which people were forced to fend for themselves, then people would quickly devolve into a state where they would essentially do everything and stop at nothing to save themselves. It's certainly a very pessimistic, cynical, and nihilistic take. And the Joker in the movie, spoiler alert, if you still haven't seen this movie yet, I'm about to give away a major part of it. Towards the end of this movie, the Joker sets up a scenario where the city of Gotham is in a state of emergency and people start to flee and evacuate the city. And he set up 2 ferries with bombs, and he explained to them, I have set up both of these ferry boats with bombs. People on both ferries have a detonator that can make the other ferry explode. And if one of the ferries explodes, then the other one is free to go. But until then, they're both stuck, floating on water. And he also gave them a timeline, which was that at midnight, if neither boat had made the decision to destroy the other one, then he would step in and destroy both. And this is a pivotal scene because it's supposed to test the character and the integrity of not just the people of Gotham, but the soul of Gotham. What was Gotham about? Is Gotham a city where people looked out for each other, where in the most desperate times their humanity and decency and integrity remained? Or was Gotham really as the Joker thinks it is? It is just a place that is one push away from where order has broken and trust in society has completely disappeared, and where people are willing to go so far as to kill others if it means their own survival. Spoiler alert, the people of Gotham did not blow up either boat, and of course Batman saves the day. Everyone goes home happy. And I think the idea that Christopher Nolan, the director, was trying to sell was that he believed in the better of people. He believed that when people were forced to make hard decisions, that they were in situations where things had broken down, society has broken down, the social contract has broken down, that people would still choose to do the right thing, that their humanity would remain. And I can say for the most part, during the pandemic, like I mentioned, the mutual aid orgs, a lot of people did help out others. But it was very clear that there was a contingent of people, I don't know how many of them, that simply refused to make any level of sacrifice, that simply refused to accept any inconveniences. So now, I've got the shelf, it can stand on its own. All right, let's finish up this video. So the first 2 things that I talked about, things that were my observations about the pandemic 5 years later, were mostly about things that happened during the pandemic. I think this final observation is in retrospect as we look back on things 5 years later. And for me, I look back on this and I say, what has changed or what has not changed? I think the best way to describe it is that
it seems like we haven't really learned anything. There are no shortage of people who still go to work when they're not feeling great, coughing and sneezing. I've certainly ran into a fair share of them working at my last job at TikTok. And I understand there are people who have jobs that they actually need to perform in person, whether they work in service industry, trades, restaurant, whatever it is. I get that. And there are people who need their jobs to survive. So yes, if you're not feeling great, you go to work. However, for people who are working these big tech office jobs, there's no real excuse for going into the office if you're not feeling well, if you do have an active cough or sneeze. For starters, you should stay home to recuperate. And if you really have to, I'm pretty sure your manager would understand and just let you work from home. Beyond that, it's just sort of selfish and silly and stupid to one, trek into the office when you're not feeling great. You have to spend all that extra time and energy commuting. But secondly, you're risking infecting others, your fellow colleagues and coworkers, with whatever it is that you have. Another aspect of this, we sort of haven't learned anything as far as health and wellness and sanitary conditions and all of this stuff, is that I now routinely see people on the subways and the buses who are just coughing and sneezing into open air, just literally doing it right in front of them, wherever they stand. Doesn't matter who's around them. None of it matters. It's like we didn't just go through a pandemic where millions of people died to a virus and disease that was spread through the air. That was an airborne virus and spread through the air. People are back to just coughing and sneezing wide openly. Or I would say, I'm not even sure if this is worse. I've also seen people cough and sneeze into their hand and then immediately put that same hand onto a handlebar. That's terrific for whoever the next person is that's going to come and hold on to that bar. They've just now got a handful of whatever it is that person had. On a quick side note, I just want to point out that on the topic of people should stay home if they're not feeling well, I contracted COVID-19 just once, and I lasted for a whole 2.5 years until I contracted it in September of 2023. And I caught COVID roughly 1 week after my company mandated everyone return to the office, which was a crazy coincidence, but I'm pretty sure I caught it from someone who was forced back into the office. So thank you, TikTok. Thank you for that. The one and only time I contracted COVID. And I think the last part of this is I would also say, as a society, we haven't changed anything either. You would think a pandemic that was such a huge health issue and one that killed so many people and made so many other people sick, that coming out of it, we might have stronger laws related to accessibility of healthcare, sick leave, medical leave, family leave, et cetera. Just laws and regulations in place so society is more accommodating, I guess, for a lack of a better term, to people who do get sick, whether that is with COVID or something else. But no, we really haven't done any of that. I think the only long-lasting program that I know of coming out of the pandemic is that the government routinely gives away COVID-19 test kits. So that's like the one government program that's really come out of the pandemic and that's stuck around. Everything else is sort of just business as usual. I think to wrap up this video, the crazy part about the pandemic 5 years later is that we were, I don't know if told is the right term, but we all just sort of collectively agreed to just move on with our lives. There was no, memorial or memorandum for such a huge cataclysmic event. We don't talk about or grieve the people that died, the people that are still sick from COVID. We pretty much have forgotten about them entirely. It's over, guys. Just go back to work the same way you were before. It's all over, guys. Pandemic's over. We can just go back to things the way it was before. And there's been no, I guess people were given the time and the space to grieve the life that was. I think that's the best way to describe it, is that when the pandemic first hit, I was working at a certain company and I went in every day and it just seemed like in a snap that was just all gone. And there was never
room or space to grieve a life that was lost. Not just for me, but for a lot of other people. I think for a lot of other people, the life that they were living, for better or worse, before the pandemic hit was just, evaporated overnight. So that's it. That's all I've got for this video. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video. And as always, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too.